Yeah, my name is Roland. Welcome all. For those of you joining us on the live stream, thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited. My family came to Richmond as immigrants in 1980. And my family and I have enjoyed the many benefits and countless opportunities that Canada had to offer. Unfortunately, this is not the case with many of the First Nations people. Their struggles, both past and present, have opened my eyes and touched me deeply. So I sincerely hope that we Canadians can come together and learn more about our history and work hand in hand to achieve true respect, healing, and reconciliation. So I'm here in Richmond, BC, so please join me in acknowledging the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and Kwantlen First Nations, on which we are learning, teaching, and working today. It is also with great pleasure that we welcome Danilo Caron, who is a Master of Applied Science student in Civil Engineering and a project engineer with Urban Systems Ltd. Born and raised in Kamloops, Danilo is of mixed Italian and Anishinaabe heritage with ties to Castelfranco, Veneto, Italy, and Sagamok Anishnawbek First Nation in Ontario. Since 2017, Danilo, his wife Jewel, and daughter Cicada have been visitors on Musqueam traditional ancestral and unceded territory. Danilo combines his construction background and applied science education to his project and construction management research. His research focuses on project delivery methods, their ability to harness Indigenous ways of knowing, and how the engineering industry can advance reconciliation in a broader Canadian society. When Danilo isn't studying or working, he can be found running the local trails or walking the nearby beaches with Jewel and Cicada. So, and Danilo, we have, we want to present you a little gift. It's not much, but it's a T-shirt. It's one thing that all of us at Game of Apps, all the mentors and the students, we all have T-shirts, and this one is for you. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll get this to you somehow over the next week or two. But everyone, please join me in welcoming Danilo Caron.
Well, thank you, Roland. I see someone put in there that it's a limited edition T-shirt, so I feel extra special. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ani bonjour, Danilo Nindijnakas, Wabazeshi Nindodum, Kamloops Nindunjaba, Sagamok Anishnawbek, First Nation Dibendagos, Ninjigudaya Vancouver, Nimigwech Wendam, Kenny Congo Mampi, Gibijayan. Hello, greetings. My name is Danilo. I'm a member of the Martin clan. And as Roland said, I'm from Kamloops, and I'm a member of the Sagamok Anishnawbek First Nation. And I currently live in Vancouver. And I'm just really honored and pleased to be here today. Roland I had this little, basically I was going to tell you who I am, but Roland kind of gave you all the goods on me, essentially. And thank you even, for mentioning like where I'm calling in from. It's we're here at UBC campus, which is Musqueam Traditional Ancestral and Unceded Territory. We're really blessed to be here, especially on a sunny evening like right now. So I thought I would give you a quick outline of what I'm going to chat about today. First I want to just applaud you all for being a part of Game of Apps, and for actually like this year's theme of equity is so inspiring. When Roland told me that this is what you were tackling now that you have all these incredible skills, I'm just so impressed. And this idea of equity, it just encompasses so much. I'm going to describe kind of the challenges facing Indigenous communities in Canada, and clearly I'll go into that in more detail later, but I'll spend a chunk of the time talking about that. And I also want to connect it at the end, to this, to how the challenges facing Indigenous communities are, how we respond to those, largely known as reconciliation. And I'll describe reconciliation later and how it's kind of defined, but also what it means to me, and also like how that connects to like not only the task that you're doing with Game of Apps, but maybe hopefully you'll see other ways in your life that you can kind of embody reconciliation to. So, I'd love to just jump right into chatting about the challenges that many Indigenous people and communities are facing today. But it's really important that I actually take a step back, because with many problems, you really want to understand, what is the history behind it? Why are you trying to solve something? So in a more abstract way, when we're problem solving things, you also want to understand as much as you can about it. And when you're trying to understand the challenges that communities are facing, it's really important to understand how did we get here as a society. And so I am not going to bore you to death. That was my kind of promise to myself, because I do some of these talks to different types of audiences. And I could do the one with dates and treaties and stuff like that. And then today's, I think, will be intentionally kind of give you a sense of how we got to today, what today is like, and then looking into the crystal ball of what tomorrow could look like too. So so looking back, basically when settlers first started arriving from Europe, you'll hear me mention a lot about relationships today. And so the relationship started very different than it is today. And it's very easy to understand, as few settlers started coming, that there was a relationship based largely on reliance at first, because they were in a new land with new conditions. And there were a lot of relationships based on that. And then there was trade, through the fur trade, but other resources as well. There was intermarrying, so there was familiar, relationships. There was also alliances in wars. So the relationship between the first peoples of Turtle Island or North America and settlers has evolved. And so it started out in one way. And I thought I would use one example of an earlier agreement or a treaty that was between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. It was in the 1600s, so we're going way back. But this is a very famous and a very important one. It's called the Two-Row Wampum, which the Dutch embodied the principles of friendship in their own way with these silver rings and written down. And the Haudenosaunee, their way was to capture the stories in wampum beads. So it's a beaded belt that captures two boats traveling side by side in their own way, and in friendship, but also in respecting each other's ways of life. And this was a very early example, and there are other treaties that are similar that kind of show this idea of the first relationships being one of mutual respect. And as time has changed, the relationship has evolved. And there are some fundamental differences, between how settlers viewed the land ownership and resources, and how Indigenous people view their relationship to the land as opposed to land ownership. And over time, Indigenous people have been seen as an impediment to Western expansionism and also to access land, because as Indigenous people holding land in trust as a community or as a group or as a nation, that was often stopping Western or European ideas of land ownership and resource ownership, like trees and stuff like that. That was important at the time. And so this relationship slowly, I guess, degraded. And that's probably a really polite way of saying that. And there's some, and here's one of those things that's actually in the news recently, because the Pope, a delegation of Indigenous representatives just visited the Vatican. I'm not sure if folks heard about that. And so this idea of the Doctrine of Discovery has been on the radio a bit, in the kitchen as I'm getting breakfast ready and stuff like that. And it's really interesting because it doesn't get a lot of attention otherwise. But the Doctrine of Discovery actually came from these papal bulls, which are just basically saying the Pope says stuff. And the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church, had a lot of power, still does, but back in the day, it had an even more power. And the Doctrine of Discovery is basically a whole bunch of doctrines and policies and practices that basically advocated, for the superiority of some people over others, based on their national origins their racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences. So that's something like nowadays we would probably feel a lot different if the Pope was coming out and saying in 2022, saying that I decree that European nations can just go places and based on their superior racial status, they can do stuff. And there's a whole bunch of like these Doctrine of Discovery includes a whole bunch of different things. So nowadays, I think we would push back against that. However, the Pope has never, or the Catholic Church has never taken that back, and it's actually the legal and moral foundation for the Canadian legal system. Which, when people hear that sometimes for the first time, they think that the legal system, the Crown, which is like the Queen, the Queen's legal system, which Canada has continued, and it forms what most people consider like the mainstream legal system, is based on the Doctrine of Discovery. And that sometimes is unsettling because it's clearly any kind of policies that are based on racial superiority, about religion or ethnic background, stuff like that, is clearly problematic. And so it's an educational thing that is actually, I'm really happy to hear that one of the requests of Indigenous people have been for the Catholic Church to renounce the Doctrine of Discovery. And for many reasons, and I suspect it's largely legal, they would be hesitant to do that because so many things are hinging on these principles of racial superiority, which is kind of shocking and a little bit of disappointing and a little unsettling too, I find. Now, there's this other interesting term called terra nullius, and it has been used to deny Indigenous communities or to take land from them. And terra nullius basically means that the land was never owned before, and that's another settler mechanism in which land was seized. In British Columbia, being largely unceded with very few treaties, even into the 1900s, terra nullius was used to take land from Indigenous communities based on the fact that the Crown thinks that they're not using the land, in a way that's suitable, or just taking it because they're claiming that it was never owned before because the inhabitants weren't Catholic, right? So that's highly problematic. And here in Vancouver, the Squamish Nation just recently got land back in Kitsilano, and it largely due to one of these land seizures. They were moved off of land in Kitsilano probably maybe 125 years ago or so, kind of turn of the 19th or 20th century, right, the early 1900s. And they're getting some of that land back right now. It's right by the Burrard Street Bridge. And that's just one example of how these policies kind of impacted communities. Now, early kind of Aboriginal policy, we can kind of bring them down. We can kind of narrow it, like the goals of early policy, down to three things. And that was to eliminate Aboriginal governments, to terminate the treaties that were established, and also to assimilate. And assimilate is to cause Aboriginal people to not exist, and as a distinct legal, cultural, religious, and racial entity. So these policies of assimilation were aimed to eliminate the Indian problem. And this is actually I should use quotes around the Indian problem because a prominent political figure had no problem at the time saying that we have to get rid of Indians, essentially. Using the term Indian kind of was a normal thing back then. And the idea being is to have access to the land, because it's always about the land. And that's, I'll come back to that. Another kind of very uncomfortable thing to kind of talk about is cultural genocide. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'll be talking about it later as well, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released, like their findings were released in 2015. So it's relatively new, and we're just as a society trying to figure out how we put their calls to action into place. And just to give you a little bit of history, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission traveled the country listening to survivors of residential schools and compiling all the stories into numerous reports that kind of capture the history, capture the stories, and for many people bring closure to a very horrific time in their lives, or maybe their parents and grandparents' lives. And I guess I'm a second generation residential school survivor. My mom went to residential school, my aunt went to residential school, and so did my grandma. And this was just this process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has really galvanized the notion of reconciliation in Canada. It was because it was such an exhaustive process, and because it really drew on so much emotional energy from survivors, Indigenous communities, and their allies, that it's a significant turning point, I think, in Canadian culture, because many people, while they may not truly understand how to advance reconciliation, they've at least heard of it, and they know that reconciliation is this thing that is an action between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's about rebuilding relationships, and it's much more than that. But if you take anything away from this idea of reconciliation, it's about relationships. And remember earlier I said I'm gonna mention relationships a lot, because it's very central to the challenges Indigenous communities are facing. There's this woven through our relationships with the rest of Canadian society, with the Crown, and also relationships within these communities who are often healing from a lot of these things, like the residential schools. The cultural genocide is a destruction of the structures and practices that allow a group to continue as a group. And it includes a few things. I'm going to list them off for you. Destroying the political and social institutions of a targeted group, seizing land, forcibly relocating people and strictly restricting their movements, banning Indigenous languages, persecuting spiritual leaders, banning spiritual practice, and confiscating or destroying objects of spiritual value. Now these things are not things that are unique to Canada. Cultural genocide has happened in other places around the world, but it's important to note that all these things the Canadian government did. And communities are at various places healing and coming to terms with this, and to reestablish cultural practices if they were outlawed, rebuilding or kind of strengthening languages and getting them spoken again, because in many cases languages were outlawed or certainly curtailed. And also legal governance, like governance models in terms of how a community is organized. A lot of those have been lost. And also legal orders, which would essentially be like Western legal orders, but just Indigenous ways of dealing with conflict, resolution, and stuff like that. Those existed, and this kind of is contrary to what the Crown would like people to believe about this idea of terra nullius, of that the land is empty and no one owns the land and there's no one here. And in reality, there were a lot of Indigenous people here with a great diversity of languages and cultures that they're just kind of in some cases just rebuilding, and in some cases very much alive. Many of you have heard of the residential school system. I have already mentioned it. There was another kind of very systematic taking of children in the 1960s. It's called the 60s scoop. I have a sister that my mom gave up in the 60s and was adopted to a German and Argentinian family. She actually found us about 4 years ago. So she grew up, she was I guess a member of the 60s scoop, that she was adopted out to non-Indigenous community, didn't have connection to her culture, had actually no records, and then through a very committed and process, she eventually found my sister, and then eventually found my mom. So we have a very happy story about the 60s scoop because Marlene has returned to us. But that's not the case for many people. And it's a very sad and unfortunate part of our history. Now, as I transition to today, I wanted to mention the Indian Act. Again, it might be something that folks have heard about. It was first initiated in 1876. And so it's long-standing, but it is still intact today. And it's had many revisions over the years. And many of the revisions were never intended to improve the quality of life or for Indigenous people, or to allow them to access the economy or to education. In many ways, the Indian Act was amended to continually move the goalposts, right? To make it illegal for Indigenous people to attend university without losing their status, or for Indigenous women to marry a non-Indigenous man without losing their status. It's always been changed to essentially keep Indigenous people, where they're at. And this is one of these barriers that Indigenous communities are coming out of. The Indian Act controlled many of the aspects of Indigenous people's lives. It still does. And if you live on reserve, it controls just about everything. It controls, who can be an Indian, or like an Indigenous person who is classified officially, band membership, land access, all sorts of different things. So this is very much alive today, although revised many times. Now, also regarding now, I'd like to transition fully to today. The Indian Act is still here, but with respect to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining mutual relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in the country. All right, for this to happen, we acknowledge what's happened in the past, which is very critical. The harms that have been inflicted, the atonement for the harms, and action, and it also embodies action to change behavior. And I'm going to mention another kind of relatively new process or new kind of structures called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, otherwise known as UNDRIP, and I'll call it UNDRIP from now on. And this is a really big part of today and also into the future. This often referred to as a framework for reconciliation because UNDRIP is it's about creating the minimum kind of standards for communities to survive and for their languages to thrive and their cultures to be intact. And therefore, that's a large part of Canada's rebuilding relationships with Indigenous people, is to acknowledge that there are many cultures, that there are relationships to the land that have been very intentionally severed. There's part of their culture often is interwoven with access to the land. So when lands are removed or there's limited access to them, that has this effect of severing culture from communities, which is very harmful. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually refers to UNDRIP in Call to Action 92, which is really important for me personally, because it calls on the corporate sector, to use UNDRIP as a framework and to apply the principles, norms, and standards that are in it. And that's one that as designers or in technology, I think is one that's really pertinent, because we work in a field that has influence over technologies that are being used or that will be used, oftentimes for profit corporations, and it's a responsibility of not only the government and private citizens, but also for the corporate sector to enable a rebuilding of relationships. So if I were to look forward to tomorrow to find out, what are the ways that we can support and get behind Indigenous communities so that they can kind of fully access the economy, maintain and promote their forms of governance as they were before settlement, and also during settlement. Like if I go back to those original relationships where it was affirmed that, even with treaties, that Indigenous are in distinct communities with their own customs and governance. Over time, that changed. And so how can we, going forward, support communities in this rebuilding of their legal orders and their governance structures? And as I mentioned, this can be a very challenging prospect because it brings a lot of uncertainty. And we know the way we do things. Whether that is the way our cities are structured, the way that we that the Crown allows developments and stuff like that. So oftentimes there's a concern that allowing Indigenous communities to have more input on how their lands are resources are managed or extracted. Oftentimes that causes people concern. But what's interesting, a very important lesson that's coming out of this evolving relationship is that when Indigenous communities can access the economy and are part of projects and have can apply their legal orders within their territory, that's good for the Canadian economy in general. The mining industry is a very, very good example of this, and in many ways there many very proactive players in the mining industry who recognize that UNDRIP can be a very positive part of doing business, because Indigenous people don't just want to stop all resource extraction and everything, but it has to be done in a way that allows them their continued access to lands that are culturally important, so that there's a sustained and also just this notion of relationship with land is there may be some different perspectives on what can be developed and what can't be, but basically the notion of UNDRIP allows companies to enter into more mutually beneficial and consent-based project development. And whether that is mining or electricity generation with green technologies, or oil and gas, whatever it is, a lot of companies are coming to the realization that you can embody reconciliation, you can adopt UNDRIP, you can promote these qualities and still make a profit. You can also improve the quality of life of Indigenous communities because they have a stake, or they have some input and sovereignty over their lands, which is a critical part. Now, I also want to transition now to talking about how you're going to be developing your apps kind of with a social equity lens. And I get asked this frequently about working with Indigenous communities specifically, and I thought I would share some ideas with you that you may find valuable as you start to look at what challenges there are, how you go about learning about those challenges, and how you start to incorporate them into your idea, your big problem. How do you tackle this? So I already mentioned that Indigenous communities are at different stages of healing and reestablishing their languages, cultural practices, legal orders, and governance structures. And it's absolutely impossible, to try and categorize them all as like one entity. I think that's a mistake people make, and it's called pan-indigenizing. British Columbia of Canada has the most diversity of Indigenous languages and cultures, and the most number of Indigenous communities. And I think that's important kind of to frame when you're looking at your social equity, your social justice kind of big questions, is to recognize that from the outset, so that that your solutions are also going to have to reflect the diversity within the communities, within the communities, but also within the different types of challenges that you'll be addressing. There's this mantra that's used frequently, and it's not exclusive to Indigenous communities, but it's nothing about us without us. So that's something to remember. And I know that it's going to be really hard for you because you're working in small groups, and you're not necessarily going to have access to someone from a local nation to bounce ideas off of. But it's something that you should be mindful of as maybe like a blind spot as you're developing your apps or your designs or your concepts, is that you should be checking if your ideas are meeting what the community needs. So this idea of nothing about us without us. So there's ways of getting around that, even if you don't have a team member with a connection to the communities, or there's plenty of research that you're probably going to have to dive into in the sense of just understanding the problem. Like when I started this conversation, I talked about how you really got to understand the root causes of social inequities to be a really effective problem solver, and to propose solutions through technologies in this case, but to propose solutions that would address those inequities. So to keep that in mind, that if you don't have that kind of expertise on your team, is that you should be mindful of how do you run your idea, before you advance it too far. How do you make sure that you're on track to solving the problem you think you're solving? So that's just a good design practice, to be honest, is to always be checking your assumptions and to make sure that what you're designing to is what you should be. And there's this idea that Indigenous communities need people to come in and save them, and that in many cases, this idea of like a savior mentality can be very counterproductive, because many nations and communities are very strong and capable. They are, however, burdened by some very structural inequities around access to land, or even access to the economy in certain ways, access to capital in terms of how do they borrow money to bring a business to fruition. There's all these different things that stand in their way, and oftentimes they don't need someone to come in and save them. They need partnerships. They need to share ideas. They need to work through these with people. So that's something also I'd like you to keep in mind as you work on your social equity big problem, is to keep in mind that that there are four qualities, I think, that are really important, that when you approach these types of problems, and this theme of equity for Game of Apps this year, is to bring humility, empathy, curiosity, and an open mind. I think those four things are really important, and they're critical actually when it comes to the topic that you're exploring. But I would also say that those four things are also really important, and for any designer, whether you're an architect, an engineer, software developer, no matter what, because all of these qualities may not be what you would expect out of those professions that I just mentioned, but you can't arrive at a great solution without measures of each of those. So I'd like to just kind of close with some key takeaways of things that I've mentioned. Is, our relationship, like broader Canadian society with Indigenous people is all about relationships, and it has evolved over time. And because it devolved and was very harmful for basically 150 years until today, and there are still a lot of structural inequities already to date, that doesn't mean that relationships can't also be rebuilt and strengthened. And that's key message I want to leave with you. And this idea of truth and reconciliation, I also want to emphasize this idea of truth before reconciliation. You'll hear that from a lot of people, and especially elders who have borne the brunt of the discrimination and racism, the residential school systems, or the 60s scoop. Taking the time to understand the why we're here in 2022, and you have delegates going to the Vatican to get an apology, like what brought us here today. So this idea of not rushing through truth to get to the reconciliation is really important. So I always try to emphasize that to people, even though there's a temptation just to kind of let's just get to work on reconciliation. Reconciliation, oftentimes it's foggy and it's uncertain. But if you understand the truth really well, if you've spent time to understand that, then reconciliation is a lot easier because you'll see it for what it is. And when you're trying to question, whether your actions are adding or contributing to reconciliation, you'll understand because you'll have spent the time understanding why it's important. And as you explore the theme of equity, I just want you to don't be afraid of taking on a topic that you don't fully understand. So some of you now are in the stage of looking at these big problems, and you're trying to decide, what are you going to tackle? Don't be scared away from the questions that you don't understand, right? So whether it's there's so many different sources of inequity, but as you're looking at them, kind of lean into the ones that maybe you don't have all the answers for, and that's the humility, is being willing to say that I don't know this, right, but I need to learn this, or I have to, that's a very important characteristic, and this idea of curiosity, just being willing, the willingness to and desire to learn and just to figure stuff out. It's just this natural. Sometimes for some people it comes naturally, and for some people, you got to almost practice it. And of course, an open mind will allow you to explore these options, in ways that maybe you wouldn't have originally thought were viable. But sometimes it's nice to surround yourself with people who think differently. So I just want to thank you very much for letting me share a little bit about the truth, about yesterday, today, and hopefully shed a little bit of light on where I think tomorrow could go. And I wish you all the best with your project with Game of Apps and how you tackle equity. I'm really happy, and I'm really, if you have any questions, there's no such thing as a stupid question. I came here mostly just to answer questions, but I figured I would talk for a bit first.
Okay, thank you so much, Danilo. That's a lot of good things that you mentioned, and it was very eye-opening to me, and I'm sure to a lot of the people here too. A number of things really stood out for me. We hear about stories like the residential schools, but sometimes we don't really understand where it came from. So a little walking through a bit of the history for us really helped a lot. And also just the blind spots that we have, right? Like we sometimes problem solvers, we have the desire to solve problems, but we do it with a savior mentality, like you said. So things that you said, like nothing about us without us, or something. Yeah. So those are really good. So everyone, let's take this advantage of this time to ask questions to Danilo. So while you're getting your thoughts together, for those in the live stream, type it in the chat, and for those here on Zoom, the students, you can maybe raise your hands, and then you can unmute yourself and show your video, and you can ask the questions directly. So while you're doing that, I'll kick it off with the first question, and maybe this is a stupid question too, Danilo, and I guess it just shows my kind of the level of my understanding. There's a long ways for me to go still to really understand the issue, but like land acknowledgements. So I did one today, and we hear that a lot when we see different meetings with politicians and all that. And I understand it's great because it makes us remember that, hey, the land that we're on was unceded. But is there more beyond that in terms of the land acknowledgements?
Sure. I have a lot of opinions about land acknowledgements, and I guess I've seen them evolve and also devolve. I think it's New Brunswick. I think like the provincial governments has stopped doing land acknowledgements because they're in litigation, like there's a couple cases where, so it's interesting, something that was originally meant for to acknowledge the history of the land that people are on, can also become very politicized. And so, like you mentioned, you hear politicians giving land acknowledgements. I hear a lot of professors giving land acknowledgements and stuff like that. I think the really critical thing is I've heard a lot of good ones and a lot of really bad ones. And sometimes when the business at hand has nothing to do with Indigenous topics or anything like that, then it's very easy for people just to kind of like could be very performative in the sense of like, let's just do this, it'll take a minute and get it over with so we can get on with business. I almost wish that those maybe people wouldn't even do one, because it's very transparent that it doesn't mean anything. I'm very fortunate in that when I do a land acknowledgement, it's usually because I'm entering into dialogue, like tonight, discussing some of the challenges, history, relationship building, like all these things are really connected to the actual acknowledgement of the land that we're on. And the best land acknowledgements by far are the ones that, yes, they acknowledge the territories that we're on, maybe some of the history, but they open the conversation and they invite people into a learning process. If that learning process and that conversation even includes the whether a land acknowledgement is worth the time, that is at least bringing people into the conversation. So even if the conversation is about why are we doing this, the best land acknowledgements are the ones that bring people together in dialogue with the goal of learning, right? And when you're learning as a group like we are tonight, this and some of these are going to actually be transitioned into action. I mean, we're really hitting on everything that we can do to advance reconciliation. We're learning, we're acknowledging, we're communicating and sharing, and we're gonna and some of the participants in Gabe of Apps, they're gonna action it. I mean, it's like the absolute best experience. So I don't know if I answered your question, but there's reasons in there, and there's also there's things I'd like people to think about if they're going to do one of those quick ones, is maybe just ask yourself why you're doing it.
Okay, awesome, great, thank you, Danilo. Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions. So we'll open not just for students, mentors here. If you have questions, please feel free to ask as well. So, do we have any questions from the floor?
Danilo, Richard, I'm Richard. I have a question. I guess outside of Canada, let's say other parts of North America, or maybe the other side of the world, have there been similar kind of Indigenous people having similar groups voicing their concerns and the history part of it? Like, have you had encounter any similar situation outside?
Yeah, they're definitely. What's really interesting is what we have in Canada is not just colonialism, it's settler colonialism, which is different because basically people who came, had no intention of leaving, whereas other settler colonies were purely about extracting, whether it was rubber, cane, oil, whatever it is, right? So it's an interesting situation, but not unique. Australia, New Zealand, United States. These four countries often stand out in not always the best ways. So I'll use an example, and I may get the countries wrong, but like UNDRIP originally didn't pass. Like in 2007, it passed at the UN, but there were some very obvious dissenting voices, and it was Canada, New Zealand, United States, and England, I think. I mean, it was, so it really highlighted those who took offense to Indigenous nations asserting sovereignty over, their traditional territories, that clearly cut a little close to the bone for some countries. And what's interesting also, just off memory, is I read out the cultural genocide, is when the cultural genocide wasn't wasn't added to the definition of genocide on an international stage. I think only 2 or 3 countries that were against it, and again it was, I think, Canada, Australia, and France or something, right? So again, it's really interesting. So Richard, you're correct in that there are things, there are movements like this in other parts of the world. It's also draws out some similarities and some patterns. What's interesting is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we had from I think 2009 to 2015. South Africa had one, which was very similar, right? And it, I'll mention something in passing here, but it's also very interesting is that South Africa sent representatives to Canada to understand the residential school system before apartheid was a full-on thing. So it's almost like they came to study Canada's system, and then eventually apartheid ended. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission there where parties were free to testify, and then and got legal immunity. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation was slightly different, but yeah, it's happened.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Next question. Don't be shy. I know the students in our last call, you guys were pretty shy, and then after the speaker left, you guys had so many questions. So you can ask your questions now while the speaker is here. Okay, Sonia's asking, how did you get into doing these talks?
That's a good question. I went back to school to be an engineer after being a masonry contractor. So I was working, doing something else totally different. Well, not totally different, but different. And then when I went back to school the second time, because I had gone to school after high school, like most people do, and I definitely took an interest in how the university was organized, how things happened, admissions, curriculum, and stuff like that. So I eventually I still have a job with University of British Columbia in Applied Sciences, where I support decolonization and indigenization initiatives. And I guess that's where it took root. So maybe about 5 years ago, I started being part of these conversations about why it is, how do we choose what people get into engineering? How can we look at it through an equity lens? How can we recognize some systematic barriers that people face? And we don't do that just with engineering, or sorry, with Indigenous, but with other, social inequities as well. So the part of this role has spun out, and my work for Urban Systems as an engineer is with the Indigenous Communities practice group. So we design infrastructure for Indigenous communities. So my research, as Roland mentioned, is about incorporating Indigenous worldviews and values in engineering design. All of these things kind of overlap each other and intersect. So therefore, I'm asked frequently to kind of talk about different aspects of certainly the architecture, engineering, and construction industry related to indigeneity, to decolonization and stuff like that. So I find myself just kind of entering into conversation, which is my favorite part of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you for that question, Sonia. Okay. Next question. Mentors, you can ask questions as well.
So, hello, Danilo. Justin here. I'm curious. So if there's no other places that has resolved this, what can we do? Like, is there any other countries that resolve this we can learn from, or if not, then what can we do really?
What's interesting is this morning I was part of the research that I'm doing. We had this follow-up session with the design teams, and they're looking at coastal adaptation. So not software design, but this project for the city of Vancouver. They're trying to apply a decolonized lens to it. And oftentimes people ask, like, what does that even mean, right? So what they've done is that they have, at the city of Vancouver level, they have prioritized reconciliation. They've called, City of Vancouver is the city of reconciliation. They did that in 2014. They've committed to implementing UNDRIP and implementing the calls to action. They have all these high level commitments that they've made. And so the question of what can we do is more about, like, how can we action what we've already determined as being important. So there's the what we need to do is kind of embedded in UNDRIP, and it's also embedded in the calls to action. But how do we put it into our processes, right? So it'd look a little different, I'm sure, for as a software developer, as it would for an architect or an engineer who's trying to redesign False Creek in this case, for a meter of sea level rise. So that Justin, your question about, like, what can we do? Essentially, I'll use this project as an example of what they're doing. So to show you how they're doing things differently, they have knowledge keepers from Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish, and they're contributing to the design teams through sharing traditional uses of the land and the water, but also with teachings about the relationship that they had with the resources that make up False Creek. Now, the designers are trying to get out of their Western design mentality or their typical frameworks, and using kind of different metrics to quantify some of the design parameters that they're doing. So that's not answering your. I realize I'm trying to articulate, like, what this particular design team is doing. They're looking at all their process in terms of designing, and they're bringing new perspective. They're bringing the different knowledge keepers into the space. So that's one thing that can be done. And that is not only honoring the Indigenous knowledge keepers. It's strengthening relationships. It's also allowing the shoreline of False Creek to be envisioned in a way that reflects traditional uses. And in this case, it's less about hard walls of seawalls and stuff like that, and more about ecological living with the water in an ecological sense, allowing water to influence the design and certainly when it comes to sea level rise, influencing how we retreat. So Justin, I'm not. Did I touch on your answer in terms of, like, what we can do from a software engineer's perspective? It would maybe look different, right? It would be about whose perspectives are we including in the problem definition. That might be an example. Who's part of the team looking at? I kind of mentioned that nothing about us without us. If you were designing an app, to address a need for a community, maybe it was tidal, sea level rise kind of thing or whatever, incorporating at the most fundamental level, at the project goals level, what are the community's values in it, as opposed to imposing what you think the community needs. I think those are slight alterations in mindsets. Justin, can you add to your question anyway?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing what you're saying is that from a individual perspective, it's pretty much like how we do any sort of design work, is to bring the right people in, to bring the users in the room, so to speak, right? But also I'm curious about at a policy or even like a national level, because colonialism is pretty much a global event across, in the 1800s, right? And it's not just North America that was colonized; parts of Asia, Africa is done so. So I'm just curious, like whether throughout history, that means over so many years, has there any countries that has successfully mitigated these issues with local indigenous people and whoever's we colonize, and then whether we can learn from that as well?
Sadly, I don't think there are any lessons that we can draw on. And in some ways, even if we look at south of the border, I know this because these design teams that I'm researching a project with, there are Seattle and San Francisco folks and New York folks, and they're astonished with the level or at the commitment that City of Vancouver has put towards these things, and it's easy to say that project values are easy to establish, but if they are actually enacted on, then they become very powerful. So when it comes to design decisions that impact, especially over the next 80 years, the retreat, if those, it'd be very easy to say we'll just build a seawall that's taller, right? And protect Western real estate, kind of in the sense of like the 2022 model of we're going to build right up to the shoreline, we'll just protect it. The City of Vancouver acknowledges that the coastline looks very different from when the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people inhabited this land and stewarded the resources in the way that they did. Now they're looking at how as we adapt to climate change, how can we adopt the local nation's values into it? And if that means living with the water in a way where the water inundates periodically, or whether it means moving away from hard sea, from very steep gradients like a seawall to low gradients, which is like mud flats, which False Creek used to be. These are actually implementing decolonization, because the knee-jerk reaction is to protect the Western vision of a city. And a decolonized coastline would be, let's have the Indigenous communities tell us about how it was, implement that into design in a way that contributes to Western science's understanding of, silt deposition, like the erosion due to tidal forces and stuff like that. So when it comes to design, there's no getting around setting high expectations and then actually following through. So Justin, your question about like, what are other countries doing? They're not doing much of anything. And the designers from south of the border that we're talking to are astounded that the City of Vancouver is willing to entertain Indigenous informed design, because it is counter to what design principles for architects and planners are used to doing, right, and engineers. So there's things we can do, but we almost need like the political and social will to allow it to happen.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Danilo. That to me is kind of, because a lot of these big problems that we are discussing, we naturally think, okay, this can only be addressed at the government level, at the municipal, provincial level. But I think what you just mentioned, Danilo, is at the social level. This is kind of where the grassroots, this is where we can play a part, I think. Because we like, especially for us software developers, we are not in the resource extraction business. We are not in fisheries. We're not in forestry. We're not in architecture. So, our linkage or connection to the land is not as evident as some of these other industries. But but where we have a strong linkage is the social values of the people, and some of these changes definitely need to be enacted at the macro level, at the government levels, but that won't happen unless there's social pressure. Mm-hmm. And if there are parts where we can play in the tech industry, where we start helping society recognize the injustices and the inequities that have been done, generational inequities, right? Then even if we can move the needle a little bit at a time, that's something that I think that we could do. There's a question from Vivian and Danilo. Would love to hear your thoughts on the differences and challenges of people with mixed backgrounds like yourself versus being fully Indigenous.
Yeah, there's what's really interesting is, I'll give you like the 30-second my life story. is I'm like half Italian. My dad is from Italy. My mom is from Sagamok, Anishnawbek, First Nation. She moved west right after finishing. She did residential school, then she did teachers college, and then she moved all the way across the country to the Sunshine Coast. And I grew up essentially in an Italian family, right? So I spent, I had very little connection up until my late teens. And once I could actually travel on my own, then I was making yearly trips back to Sagamok to meet and to kind of introduce myself and to become acquainted with my uncles and aunts, my grandma at the time, and just to try and understand that part of me that I had really no connection with. So that's a really good point, because part of assimilation, this idea of absorbing Indigenous people into the broader public, has had some effect, right? And it did in my family, because my mom just never wanted to go back, right? So while we visited as a family a couple times in my whole, my whole kind of up until I was a teenager, and there's reasons behind that disconnection. And I've had to really, as an adult, I've had to really make those connections. And now as an adult, I'm learning my Anishinaabe Moa and my tongue through my mom and through an aunt. These connections are getting stronger. I think your question is about, like, are there challenges between? I'll answer this, but there are challenges about being like mixed, and that is because in the eyes of my community, I've never lived on my reserve. Right. So am I Indian enough? And I use the word Indian because that's the colloquialism that my community would use. So there is that. And do I feel those kind of inadequacies? Yeah, I do. Right. Because I've never lived on our reserve. So it's a struggle that I'm just having to get over. Are there benefits? Absolutely. Right. Like I grew up in a kind of like a middle class family with all the accesses to education, like a really good school, like a public school, but like an excellent school with great teachers, athletics and stuff like that. When I look at my community in Ontario, that is not the case, where the high school students have to go to the city where they face racism and violence, right? And for some Indigenous communities, it's way even worse, where children are to this day have to live and be billeted in large cities because there's no high schools. So the low graduation rates are definitely connected to some of these inequities, and inequities that I never faced. So that's a great question, Vivian. If you wanted to ask me a little bit more nuance, if you figured I've kind of answered it, great. But if you have, I'm happy to speak more to it if you like.
Awesome, thank you, Danilo. Oh, go ahead, Vivian.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, you kind of touched on different aspects of that. Yeah, I think there's lots to talk about, but you kind of touched it, because I'm also coming from mixed origins, and it's that what you mentioned about is like, you don't really feel that you fully belong here or there. Like you're somewhere in the middle, not even in the middle. In your case, maybe in the middle. In my case, it's like 3-4 different parts. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, Vivian.
Thank you. There's a question from Tony. I've heard talks about making it mandatory for high school students to take a course on Indigenous studies in BC. Do you think this will help in combating disparities?
There's pros and cons to this, and the University of Winnipeg has a mandatory course. So if you're doing an undergraduate degree, and I don't think it matters what field, you have to take one course, 3-credit course. Now, on the surface, there was a lot of excitement about this. It demonstrated a political will, in this case, like the university administration saying that this is a very important thing that we value, therefore we're going to implement it, right? So that had a very positive kind of, from a top-down approach to trying raising awareness. Now, Winnipeg is a very racist city, and I've never lived there, but I know from the statistics, it's also it's got the highest percentage of Indigenous people in Canada, a very high percentage. Like, I might get this wrong, but I think it's 15 or 25% or something like that. So it's disproportionately high of Indigenous people. And so this was seen as a very positive step towards just the information, because I think in many cases, inequities are born out of misunderstanding and ignorance. And however, at University of Winnipeg, what they found was that people incapable of teaching the course were teaching the course. So they were misrepresenting, or not intentionally, but they were just not qualified. So all of a sudden, I don't know how many students that university has, but they had to get everyone through a course, which is like, they just had they didn't have time to train people. They basically people were being given the curriculum and being expected to teach it. So they had a lack of capacity. So I think that your question about a course for school students, I would love the idea that there would be a comprehensive understanding, so that when you graduate from school, whether it's high school or university, that you've taken some of this content and you've processed it in a way, like most courses do, where you kind of have to kind of like work with it, produce something, an assignment or a paper, whatever. And then through that, I think that is positive. Do we have the people who can teach it honestly and accurately? I think that would have to come hand in hand. So those are my two first reactions, is that there's a great positive thing, but we have to make sure that it's taught in a way that is accurate.
Actually, can I follow up that question? I know Tony was the one that asked it, because just had a thought, is that now Canada is interesting in a sense that we have a lot of immigrants that makes up our population. I think, if I'm not wrong, the data says it sits at about 21.5% of immigrants, and it's always increasing year over year. And as an immigrant, including myself, we don't really have context as to the history of the country. I know we took the citizenship test and things like that, but we don't really have the deep seated context. So in that sense, and for most of us, reconciliation means very different things. So for example, in Asia, reconciliation meant Second World War with the Japanese occupational forces and reconciling with that. So understanding that, how can a place like Canada, with a lot of immigrants coming in every year, how can we help new Canadians really understand and contribute positively towards the solution for this issue?
What's interesting, Justin, is what I find, and this is through my work at the University of British Columbia, in helping faculty and staff with very similar, like what the Game of Apps participants are trying to do. I do similar things with the university, and there are high school students that would know way more. Well, first of all, the high school curriculum is much better than when I went to school. Right, there was no mention of it. There was actually no mention. I knew very, very little, even though my mom went, because she never talked about it. So what's interesting is chatting with professors who are from other countries, is, again, like you said, they have no context for it. They know just what they hear on the radio, and However, I do have a lot of promise because I know, like even my daughter being 11 years old and in school, that they do have access to this. Orange Shirt Day has provided a yearly kind of laddering up of understanding as the kids get older. For new people to Canada, like I don't know if it's possible to, like you said, there's an immigration like process with the test. You would be a better judge of what, if that can be more robust. Like I can't speak to the level of effort that takes, and whether you feel that it was just too easy and that there should be more material. My feeling is that we're all on this journey of kind of understanding this. I certainly am. Every time I talk to my mom, I learn more. As I learn my language, I learn more because she teaches it to me. Oftentimes brings up stories for her. So every session we have is a process for me. When I talk with profs who are visiting from somewhere and have very, very, very little understanding, they too are learning. And my only answer is that, it takes a personal commitment to pick up some Indigenous written fiction, or to watch a documentary and stuff like. There's so many different access points to understanding the context. So I'm not really sure, Justin, if you were asking about, there's lots of ways I can point to people, how they can kind of get a better understanding and rely and really good sources, like creative Indigenous storytellers and movie makers and stuff like that. And I'm not sure, Justin, if you were asking about the immigration process, because I couldn't tell you about that one.
Yeah, it's not so much of an immigration process. It's more, like if you're aware of that, hey, there's this history, there's definitely avenues that you can work on. But I think it's more of when people moved here from somewhere else, they have no context. So it's a case of you don't know what you don't know, right? So if I don't know that this thing exists or it's even a thing, I can't even take the first step towards even like reading up about it or anything, even research about it, search it up on the internet about it. So then how, people might care, but it's just because they're from a different place, they have different history, and they have zero clue about what's going on. How can we help folks understand better?
What's interesting is, we had our first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation last September 31st. It's Orange Shirt Day. I think that was asked for in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that is it's for many people, it's a holiday. And myself, I view that particular day like I do Remembrance Day. And I think that over the years, attending Remembrance Day ceremonies and listening, and there's so many similarities, right? Listening to survivors of the Second World War, the Korean War, like listening to these stories helped me create a context because my family had no direct Canadian connection to the wars. I think that the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation will have a similar effect because of the programming and exposure given to it. So it's really, we've only had one. But for instance, on last year's, we held a march on university campus at UBC, and we are expecting about 300 people. I was one of the organizers, and we had over 2,000. So that was an indicator to me that there's people who want to stand in solidarity, listen to the people speaking that we had who are sharing personal stories, and just learn. So I think, Justin, to your point, I think there's many access points, and I think when we give it visibility, like a holiday that is not one that's tagged onto a Monday or a Friday, so that's just like a long weekend for people, one that actually resides on the day. I think like Remembrance Day for me, it certainly hopefully will create an opportunity for families to come together and talk about it. right? And then, and as you know, that I think there's a real rich multi-generational, intergenerational kind of opportunity for youth like my daughter who learns about it in school to educate parents, and for parents to ask questions, and you know, maybe like I mentioned, you know, like to look into other sources of information. It's not a real easy answer, but I hope that sheds some light on it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I think increasing exposure would help. And if it's a holiday that's not tagged onto some form of like shopping or barbecue, that would be great. So people can actually, you know, pair that to then get an understanding. Oh, how does this day even come about, right? Yeah. But thank you so much, Roland.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, some of this takes time, I think, because it hasn't been a big focus, you know, and I guess, you know, for me anyway, it started with me with just the revelations of all the unmarked graves, you know, last summer, that I started to really realize, hey, you know, there's more to this than you know, like, you know, I want to understand more about all these inequities that Canada had committed. Vivian posted a message. There's a great bookstore in Chinatown here in Vancouver, Massey Books. It is an Indigenous owned and operated bookstore, and they have many books and events in the store. So that's a good possible resource. Yeah, some of these things, I guess, you know, because it's not forefront in our society. I guess it's something that we have to take the effort to kind of educate ourselves. There's a question from Elaine. It's already 8 o'clock, so I'm not sure what your time is, Danilo. But there's a question from Elaine. It sounds like a good question. You mentioned that there are things that are a general rule of thumb with Indigenous nations policy, like respect for land and less absolute definitions of ownership. You also mentioned that there are a lot of variety in the Aboriginal cultures. Is there a way to try to cater to one and all without overly implementing those similarities to the point of stereotyping?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm struggling through this right now. I'm developing a guideline for Engineers Canada on Indigenous engagement and consultation for engineering firms, and this is a balance that we're trying to strike with adding specificity, so that consulting engineers have some kind of direction, but also addressing like the uniqueness. And what we're trying to do and articulate is the idea of pan-indigenizing that I mentioned earlier is certainly one to be mindful of, and it's kind of like a pothole you want to avoid. And knowing that it exists, you're probably well on your way to kind of avoiding that one. If you are looking to, I'm just going to read the question again. If you're looking to do, I guess maybe I'll use the game of apps as an example. It's always good to be as specific as you can. So if you are working for a community or you're tailoring something to the community, then ask, right? So like about cultural protocols, customary practices and stuff like that. Now, if you're not, and you have to back out and you're looking at a more regional or maybe even national, then your commonalities become less, right? And if you were to look at Indigenous peoples around the world, then all of a sudden your commonalities will be less yet. So that's not a hard, firm answer. So I'm just reading that question. Is there any way to cater to one and all without? So there's no one way to cater to them all. When I mentioned that there are some commonalities that I like to say are universal for Canadian cultures, I'm very careful that it may come back and nip me in the bud, in the sense of like someone saying, well, you said that all Indigenous nations have a deep reverence and connection to the land, and every person I've ever met, that's been affirmed with every Indigenous person I've met through their own ways, whether it's spiritual values, their principles for stewardship. That's always been a case. So I'm careful to only go as far as I'm willing to like back it up with. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Elaine.
Okay, Elaine says yes. Thank you, Elaine. We're way over time, but there's a question from Linda. I think that I'd like to maybe this will be our last question. Linda's asking, since you have a background in engineering, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on Indigenous activists who protest against things like gas pipelines because they want to preserve the lands, when, to my knowledge, some of these companies want to work with the Indigenous people, such as agreeing to hire a number from that community, etc. What is the balance?
Sure. I think I'll answer this in a couple ways. And I can use like the Wet'suwet'en example because it's probably maybe the one that you're thinking of, but it's certainly a very high profile one. Is there's different governance, and this goes back to like the Indian Act governance systems, and that is the kind of what you may understand as like the chief and council. They are responsible for any activities that happen on the reserve, and this was a governance system imposed by the Crown through the Indian Act. Now it replaced other forms of government. In some cases, they were matrimonial lineage kind of government systems, which is something that was severely severed, right? So Indigenous women throughout settler colonialism have taken the brunt of assimilation policies and racist and sexism, essentially by removing them from opportunities to participate in governance systems which they used to have a major role. This is not a pan-Indigenous situation. Some communities that is the case, and some it's not. So the hereditary system of the Wet'suwet'en, in that example, they are the traditional governance system that is hereditary, so it's passed down, and they're responsible for traditional territories. So in the press, you may hear things like it's black or white, but what it is two different governance systems. One was the pre-existing, and one is the Indian Act government system. The Indian Act government system has, in the Wet'suwet'en case, they're the ones who are behind the development. They're eager to enter into benefit agreements, certainly like the one you mentioned about hiring people. When you have like 20 to 40% unemployment in some communities, there's a massive motivation to leverage any economic development possible, right? And that is a totally logical reaction, where the hereditary leaders traditionally carry more of a traditional lens to their stewardship. So in the Wet'suwet'en case, there is the disconnect there. Now, unfortunately, with the Wet'suwet'en pipeline, is that the negotiations at a very early stage didn't include both. Right. This was a mishandling, I think, because there was opportunities to have a consent-based relationship. The hereditary chiefs, I believe, proposed an alternative route for the pipeline that was turned down based on being more expensive, but it was going to avoid some sensitive areas that the hereditary chiefs were responsible for. So that's a little bit of the history there. And maybe I'll just have any thoughts about. I'd like to emphasize that these cost benefit agreements are ways for Indigenous communities to enable a capacity building within their communities, and these are mechanisms that some industry partners are already using, and to good success. Some Indigenous communities are really well poised to enter into these types of agreements, and they have their own legal orders. And the Tahltan Nation in Northwest BC is a great example. They have a stewardship plan where it's very transparent. They have an abundance of procedures that companies know exactly what they're getting into when they enter into resource projects in Tahltan territory. And this is just an example of a nation that has intact legal authorities, and they're strengthening their policies. not all nations are at the same place. Some nations are really just trying to reestablish a semblance of legal orders that had been severed in a very intentional way through colonialism.
Awesome. Thank you. Linda, does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Linda gives a thumbs up. Awesome. I really hate to end this, but we're way over time, and I don't know how much time you allocated for us too. It's probably more than what you had allocated for us, Danilo. But this is good. There's lots of discussion. We started out slow, but as we started getting into the question and answer period, people starting to voice their questions, and I guess. This is good. There's so many things that we don't understand, and I think just getting ourselves educated. It's going to be a long process, but if we're moving the needle just a little bit at a time, I think it's worth it. But Danilo, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Maybe we'll have you come back again, and we'll have part 2, and we'll have probably more questions. I hope some of these questions were not too difficult for you, but it just. Okay.
They were great.
Awesome. All right. Okay. Thank you, Danilo. So I guess we'll end this portion of the segment. If you're on the live stream with us, thank you for joining us tonight. So we're going to be ending the live stream as well. We're going to be saying goodbye to Danilo. Thank you so much. And for the Game of Apps students, we're going to go right into the next segment, or we'll give you maybe 2 minutes break, and then we'll start the next segment. But thank you, Danilo. Have a good evening.
See you later.
Okay, we'll talk to you again next time.